It started, like many of his best-laid plans, over a low-burning espresso and the humming of the ocean outside his villa. Tom Everett, whose name still carried the kind of gravity in Hollywood that caused rooms to fall silent, had been reviewing the next quarter's media strategy when the email arrived. His assistant, Jordan, had printed it on ivory stationery for dramatic flair, even though Tom preferred digital. The envelope was unsealed, folded once. Jordan claimed it gave the message. Wait. Tom thought it looked theatrical, but he played along. He opened it lazily, eyes half closed from a long morning ride through the canyon. As he scanned the page, his lips pressed together. The request was clear, an invitation to appear on Isla Redgrave's podcast, Heart of the Matter. He knew of Isla not just as a former duchess, but as a new age media force, one of those celebrities who turned vulnerability into currency. She was rebranding herself again, that much was clear. A new season, a fresh guest list, a bid for upper-tier relevance. Tom walked across the room and placed the paper flat on his oak desk. Then he poured himself the rest of the espresso, no sugar, and stared out at the sea for a full minute. He wasn't one to respond quickly. He liked to sit with things, especially when they came wrapped in quiet expectation. Later that evening, he mentioned the invite to Grant Marwood, his publicist, over a glass of club soda at the Troubadour Lounge. Grant didn't react at first, then leaned back, thoughtful. He asked Tom if he'd seen the recent headlines. The tension with Isla and the Crown, the veiled barbs from her last interview. The impression, not always fair, but persistent, that drama followed her. Tom nodded but didn't reply. He preferred to let other men speak before he did. Grant continued. He suggested that taking the podcast might send a message Tom hadn't intended. A message that could place him in the wrong camp, not politically perhaps, but symbolically. Alignment mattered now more than ever. Even silence was a kind of positioning. Tom raised his glass, nodded once, and left the lounge without confirming anything. The next morning, he handed the printed invite back to Jordan with a simple instruction. Mark it as not pursuing. No reasons given. No room left for discussion. That same week, Isla's team followed up twice, then gave up. The absence of a response was louder than a rejection. Isla Redgrave sat at her patio table with a linen notebook open and a glass of peach-infused water sweating in the California heat. It had been 8 days since the invitation had been sent. Noah, her assistant, hovered nearby with his phone in hand, pretending to check scheduling updates. Though she knew he was really watching her reaction, she hadn't said much about the delay. She didn't need to. The silence had begun to speak for itself. That afternoon, she pulled on a pair of tortoiseshell sunglasses and went for a long walk through the hills behind her estate. She had developed the habit of walking without her phone, claiming it helped her think, but today her thoughts clung stubbornly to the same loop. She replayed every word of the email Noah had sent. She tried to convince herself that it wasn't personal. She reminded herself of the guests who had said yes. But the more she rationalized, the more it stung. Later that week, while attending a launch party in Bel Air for a wellness brand co-founded by one of her friends, Isla spotted Miles Henley across the pool deck. He was leaning against the railing with his usual quiet presence, nursing a glass of white wine and fess of white wine and watching the party with vague disinterest. She approached him, more to distract herself than anything else, and before long, the subject of Tom Everett's silence emerged. Miles had worked with Tom nearly 20 years ago on an action film in Prague, and though they hadn't remained close, the professional respect had lingered. He listened carefully as Isla recounted the timeline, the initial request, the follow-up, the lack of reply. When she paused, waiting for a reaction, he looked down into his wine, swirled it once, and then shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Then he told her what he'd heard, that Tom had recently accepted a private invitation to dine with King Aldric and the royal family. It wasn't just dinner, he said. It was a diplomatic gesture, carefully organized, extremely exclusive. Isla held her expression in place, but the air around her felt thinner. She asked whether Tom was doing interviews around the same time, and Miles confirmed that he wasn't, but the implication was clear. She didn't reply right away. She just stood there with the music behind her and the distant laughter of party guests floating across the pool. Then she turned slightly, as if trying to remember something, and excused herself with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. That night, she stayed up late in her reading room, pacing between the bookshelves with bare feet and unbrushed hair. She wasn't angry, not exactly, but she felt something deeper, a kind of erosion. Not of her career, but of her space in rooms she once assumed were hers to walk into. Grant Marwood stood by the corner window of his West Hollywood office, the blinds casting long diagonal lines across the dark floor. His phone vibrated on the edge of his desk, a silent reminder that the world didn't pause, not even for precision. He reached for it, scanning the latest analytics on Tom Everett's recent European engagements. Press interest was rising exactly as planned. He locked the screen and leaned back, folding his arms. The Isla Redgrave invitation had been reviewed and dismissed 2 weeks ago. Yet the aftershocks had begun to ripple in circles Grant always watched closely: podcast circuits, op-ed subtexts, social media whispers. He had expected that. He even welcomed it. In his mind, strategic omissions often created more intrigue than direct actions. Across the city, Tom Everett had just wrapped a photo session for a British heritage magazine. He arrived at Grant's office later that afternoon wearing a black turtleneck and his usual unreadable expression. Grant didn't waste time. He showed Tom the early coverage from the upcoming royal dinner. The headlines were warm, formal, aligned with legacy. It was exactly the tone they needed. Tom nodded, briefly. Then he walked over to the liquor shelf, pulled down a decanter of something amber, and poured just an inch. He asked no questions about the podcast, and Grant offered no updates. Both men understood that sometimes words were liabilities. Elsewhere, Isla's name continued to trend in soft, echoing bursts. The fact that she hadn't been acknowledged by Everett's camp became its own narrative. Grant saw the way commentators framed it: a subtle snub, a repositioning. He knew she was being painted as peripheral, even though no one had said so outright. That was the art of the thing. In private, Grant believed Isla's platform had merit. She was articulate, emotionally intelligent, even brave. But bravery wasn't the brand they were building for Tom. What Tom needed now was institutional grace, royal association, stability, interviews that felt scripted without seeming false. Isla's strength was her unpredictability, a quality that once made her magnetic, but now made her dangerous. He updated the board on his office wall, drawing a red arrow between Tom's upcoming documentary and the Aldric dinner. Across the room, his junior assistant asked whether they should ever respond to Isla's second follow-up. He didn't look up. He simply said they wouldn't. Then he returned to his laptop, already scanning footage from the palace walkthrough, where Tom had appeared next to King Aldric with just enough warmth to suggest kinship and just enough distance to preserve mystique. The sky over Copenhagen was a grayish blue when Isla Redgrave stepped onto the stage of the Nordic Women's Futures Summit, her hair pulled back in a loose chignon and her blouse tucked crisply into high-waisted slacks. She wasn't there for press. She wasn't there for glamour. The invitation had come through an old contact in social policy, someone who still saw her not as a former duchess or podcast host, but as a thoughtful voice in modern leadership. She walked slowly to the center of the platform, the applause. Gentle but respectful, in her hand she carried no notes. The organizers had asked her to speak about resilience. She took a breath, looked out at the quiet crowd, and began with a story about standing alone in a garden in Montecito, wondering what silence meant when it came from someone powerful. She didn't mention Tom Everett by name. She didn't need to. Her words moved with a current of implication, not accusatory, but open, disarmed, honest. She spoke about the weight of waiting, the ache of invisibility, the strange way rejection didn't just bruise, it echoed. She paused often. She let the room feel the discomfort. And when she finished, the applause came in waves. Not wild, but deep. Backstage, Noah was quiet. He knew better than to ask how she felt. Instead, he handed her a glass of water and told her that clips were already spreading online. Isla nodded once and sat down beside the curtain, her heels kicked off, her toes curling against the cold tile. She looked exhausted, but there was a steadiness in her she hadn't shown in weeks. Over the next few days, viewership on Isla's podcast surged. Not because of new guests, but because people were revisiting old ones, listening to her episodes with women who'd overcome exile, loss, reinvention. Journalists wrote pieces about the Redgrave effect, calling her voice the sound of post-glamour resilience. Brands called. A film producer called. A quiet revival had begun, not by effort, but by refusal to be undone. In Los Angeles, Grant Marwood read one of those articles in the back of a car as he rode to a studio meeting. He tapped the screen twice, then minimized the window. He didn't mention it to Tom. Tom Everett, meanwhile, was in a screening room previewing footage from his upcoming biography series. He didn't speak about Isla, but that evening, after dinner, he stepped out alone onto the hotel balcony, hands tucked into the pockets of his blazer, and watched the wind carry clouds across the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, the world continued to listen, not to him, but to the voice he hadn't answered.